ready to
Yep.
start then?
I think so. This is Duke Seifried, Uncle Duke, founder of Custom Cast, Der Kriegspielers, which are companies that were the genesis, one of the ancestors of Heritage, and living legend in the game community.
Thank you, friends. Dave has asked me to talk about how this thing kind of got started. I'm going to have to take you back to the 50s, and that's before any of you were here. There were three fellows making tin soldiers. They were Dick Higgs, working for Neville Dickinson in England under the company Minifigs. For the Frank Hinchliff Company, we had Peter Gilbert. And in America, we had Uncle Duke. And I was trying to sculpture and sell and run a company, somewhat impossible task, I must confess. In any event, the way we first made these figurines, we all had learned to do what you would consider extremely intricate and complex soldering. We would have low-watt soldering irons, brass blocks, iron blocks, and we would touch the metal that we were working with to one of those blocks, or not one of those blocks, and draw solder out in long flails like swords, things of that nature, solder on little blocks, solder on little balls, solder on all kinds of things, and then proceed to grind and cut and work it into shape. That is how tin soldier patterns were made back when. I thought this was not the best way to do it. I learned about brass investment casting, where they use lost wax. I thought that was a much better way. But I didn't like losing the wax pattern. I had the good fortune to get involved with Dow Corning. And we, together, with my requirements, sort of developed an AB buff and white two-part epoxy resin that you can mold like clay. It had a certain ability at certain times. Now you took the two pieces, mixed them in equal quantities, rolled them together, heated them up, and you had 45 minutes to work with it. During the first 5 minutes it would stick like glue to anything, so you had to stick it onto your metal matrix figure. Then you could incise it, then you could pull it, then you could, as the time passed, you could do various things with it. By the time you reached 45 minutes, it was too hard to do anything with it. It was dry, it was ready. It had a curing time. Stan Glanzer, one of our first sculptors, came up with the idea of putting a light bulb in a can, and you could set the figure on it and speed this thing up. So we all adopted that. And we began experimenting with how to sculpture figurines. I passed this on to Peter Gilbert, who passed it on to Dick Higgs. Pretty soon we're all doing it this way. You see, at that time, these three companies were not bitter rivals. We were compatriots, colleagues. I mean, after all, when there's only three people in the world doing it, well, you got the idea. In any event, we began developing our abilities. At first, I had jewelry casting companies make my figurines. Then I thought, why should I be doing that? We should get the equipment and do this ourselves. And then we had to learn how to make molds, had to learn how to do this and do that, and it did grow like topsoil. My first operation was actually down in the basement, like all operations are. And then it went over to a place in Salem Avenue in Dayton, Ohio. And down in the basement, we did the work. Upstairs, we had a retail store. And we started really making these in earnest. It was during that time that I got involved with some other friends of mine, Dave Arneson, Gary Gygax. I've known them for a long time, so I was always kind of involved in Dungeons and Dragons also, although the historical people, whom the fantasy people call the hysterical people, didn't like me having a foot in each boat. I was the only one who crossed the boundary. I did fantasy and I did historical. Nobody else did both. I was the only one who did both. I couldn't see any difference. I still don't see any difference. And even in the games, you play it much the same way. So I don't really care. Figures are figurines. And well, this little company in Salem Avenue started to grow. Stan was the first sculptor other than me. And I put us on the map by having had the good fortune to have made the acquaintance of an academic over in England who wrote charming stories that I really liked. We were making other kinds of soldiers, but what put us on the map was when I went over to have high tea at the Tradition magazine shop. Tradition was a thick collector magazine, like Life magazine, showing collector figurines, which were accepted. Little teeny soldiers were not accepted for playing war games. Oh, fine. Even my own father cast aspersions upon it. Collector figurines were it, and I was always at the end of the line. I used to go to shows, because there were only shows for collector figurines, and open up my booth. I was in the display business, so I had a booth that I opened up that was 8 feet tall and 6 feet wide, or 4 feet, yes, it was 8 feet by 8 feet. And I had lots of little tin soldiers, and I was always the also-ran. And I do remember at dinner saying, one day the tail will wag the dog. And Bill Emery and Clyde Risley of that company, and Bill Murray, there were all kinds of collector figurine people, and they all knew me. I was the only one there, though, selling little tin war game soldiers. But I told them the tail would wag the dog. You got to remember that, because it turned out that that's what happened. I had this opportunity to go over at high tea and kiss the ring of Anthony Belmont Maitland, who is the editor-in-chief of Tradition magazine. And I did so, but I had most of the day, because that's at 4 o'clock. So I arranged to go out and meet this fellow that I've been corresponding with, and I told him I was going to bring some elves and dwarves and goblins, because his 2 younger kids, Chris and Priscilla, would like them. He thought they would too. We got out there, and what we did was spend the morning making sketches. When I got back to America, I gave them to Tim Kirk at American Greeting Card Company, and he rendered them in a nice rendering, for which I sculptured Fantastiques. Now, why is Fantastiques such an important landmark in tin soldiers? Up to this time, Dick Higgs minifigs were smooth figures. You had to paint all the detail out. And even my friend Peter Gilder's figures were long and lanky, and you could bend them around, and they were very viable for dioramas and so forth. But they were pretty smooth. Fantastiques was deeply engraved, very detailed, changed the whole business overnight. It made everything obsolete. So I had an opportunity to make a major mark on the whole industry. When they went out, I couldn't make them fast enough. My Fellowship of the Ring sold 10,000 blister packs. Yes, I started blister packs. I thought that was a good way to market it. And I sold 10,000 of them right away. And then 10,000 of the Great Dragon the next month. And I couldn't make them fast enough. And my little company, Der Kriegspielers, Custom Cast was the other half that did custom casting. You get the idea. And Der Kriegspielers was making the tin soldiers, but they were the same company. And it put us on the map. I started going out and selling this stuff, and everybody wanted it. I'd been selling Napoleonic soldiers before that, and I had to hit them over the head to take them. My first dealer was Lou Quigley in Chicago, Illinois, at a soldier shop. My first dealer. He's the first one that took a chance on me, and he sold them very well. He sold through. The fact is, in 4 days he called me up and he says, "I can't believe it. I sold all your shit. You want to get me some more?" I said, "Some more of that shit?" To which he laughed, but he was good to me, and he gave me a lot of tips and information. Then I started getting stores, the better-known retail stores throughout the country, in California, in New York, even the soldier shop in New York. We were quite successful. The Kriegspielers Custom Cast was getting itself on the map. And I saw that it was an opportunity. And I had kind of a vision. Now, you can laugh a little bit about this vision, but I saw maybe this could get like bowling, which has a 20% penetration. We had a maybe 1/10 of 1%. Well, after several years and putting out lots of lines, Continentals, American Revolution 25s, Confederals, 25 millimeter American Civil War, a number of other lines of which you see many examples in the catalogs. We had a lot of lines. And then we hit upon the idea of doing real 15 millimeter figurines. I had always been a Napoleonic nut, and Napoleoniques had sold pretty well, but they were kind of an odd size. They were a small 25. And those had started because I'd been trying to get Napoleonic figures from Marcus Hinton, and I sent him $1,200, which in those years was a lot of money, and he stiffed me. It pissed me off. So I did some in the style of his, copied some of his out of it, and made a lot in the style of that, and Napoleoniques came. But he stiffed me. I never heard a word. He took my money. Well, I was perhaps foolish for sending the money ahead of time, but I did. Anyway, we had a lot of lines. We were getting quite successful. And then Frank Hinchliffe, whom I had known of, and Peter Gilder, obviously, through Jim Oden, the Heritage Company here in Dallas, Texas, suggested that we could make a pretty big company if we'd merge. Now, this was an off-sided merging because I had all the sculptures. I had Max Carr, Steve Bissett, George Freeman, I don't know whatever happened to Bob Bazanis, a flaky guy, and a few others. I had trained a lot of sculptures, and we brought a lot of lines down. And all Heritage had were the Hinchliffe lines. But they had a nice place to do it in, and I saw this plant, and I thought, okay, it would work. So I took kind of a chance, and I went in business with Jim Oden and Cleve Burton. The idea being that I would get Cleve's half the business if I would merge with them. And eventually I did. Cleve left, and later went to prison for making golden money and plating it, casting it of white metal and plating it gold. And when he was, the next step in this was my great success in selling the product. Jim Oden made a commitment to deliver X amount of product, which he never did. He never get his shit together to get the product delivered. And I oversold what we could do. But they had agreed. Several years passed, or a couple years passed, and the bank, through my good friend Scott Bobo, who was the bank contact man from the bank, said they wanted to bump out Oden. They wanted to put somebody else in there with some money. and we would grow. Well, at first that wasn't too bad an idea. And we brought in a guy by the name of Ray Stockman, whom I'm going to publicly call a crook. He was a wildcat oil investor, and he did nothing but screw me continually. And finally Bobo told me about it. We were making money. They were never, even Stockman was not delivering what he had promised he would deliver. So I was still overselling it. I am at fault for that, I guess. But they said they could do it. Well, I went out and sold it. You can't unsell something after you've sold it. It's, you know, once you're pregnant, you're pregnant. You don't want to abort it. Let me put it that way. We accumulated a larger company by my bringing in Steve Peak and Craig Taylor, friends of mine, game designers, who had Yakito Games. And then I also... Yakito.
You went to Yakito after you left her, but you were Babylon.
No, it was Yakito. It was Yakito. Yeah, at that time, when we absorbed them. Yeah. It was Yakito Games. It was Craig Taylor and Steve Peak. Steve Peak, a bit of a crook himself, but competent and capable. He visualized himself as Robert Duvall. I remember that. That was his favorite persona. And he was kind of a Texas cowboy type. He liked to be that way. Craig Taylor was a very sincere game designer, nice guy. I enjoyed them both. I socialized with both of them. I shall never forget the best weekend of gaming that I can remember. My dear friend John Hill, a game designer, had done a game called Squad Leader, which you probably all know, an Avalanche Hill game called Squad Leader. And John and I did a variant using our Panzer troops, our 50mm World War II, mounted on square stands but in a diamond formation. So you would have, for instance, with a German squad, a light machine gun, MG-42 or 38, and you'd have the ammo maker on one as the point. You'd have 3 riflemen, then you'd have another 3 riflemen, but 2 riflemen and a submachine gunner, and then a single stand of an NCO with an SMG, and that made up a squad, and they were in a diamond formation. The Americans would have 12 people in theirs. They had a BAR, and so forth with all the other countries. It worked very well. A lot of what Flames of War has done was a result of seeing that. The way they have these stands and so forth. That probably, because that was pretty widely distributed. And John Hill wrote up the Fire Team miniature. It was a good playable game. It was a lot of fun. And I produced iron-on hexes, 3-inch hexes, and wooden block hexes. And you can do scenery with it, and trees. And metal plates that were hexagonal, that you could glue trees to. Oh, it was the system. And it was used for frappe and a number of games that we developed. Things went along, business increased, but we still were having this nagging production problem. Then Bobo began to tell me that Stockman was really slipping it to me. And one day Stockman and I had it out. He demanded that I relinquish more of my stock to him. He had 51, and I had 49. We had 50-50 originally. But because the bank brought him in, I had to give up that one, so I only had 49. And once he had control, he was running roughshod. And he was cheating me on the money. And some others in the company were even assisting me, I'm sorry to say. We have since mended our fences with that, but I wasn't very happy about it. It was going from bad to worse, and Gary Gygax called me and he said, well, we're going to make the big move. We want you to come up and lead the charge. So, I gave up $500,000, and I knew what would happen to Heritage. And herein, I have to offer a public apology to Dave Helber, Max Carr, Steve, any of those people I brought with me, those people who counted on me, because I knew what would happen to the company when I left. 6 to 9 months there would be no more company, and that's what happened. I think Stockman thought that he could put another individual in my place and business would go on as usual, but it didn't. And when I was now representing Dungeons and Dragons, all the distributors just sort of jumped on me, and once I was with Dungeons and Dragons, they all thought it was going to be a go, and it was a go. So the damage to Heritage probably caused the success of Dungeons and Dragons. I hate to come on strong and act like I'm such an important person in this hobby, but I am. I started the merchandising of it. I got it into the big stores. I got it into Toys R Us. I got it into Sears and those other places. I feel very bad, and I herewith apologize to Dave and all those I left in the lurch. And I have never done that, and it's been eating at me for a long time, because I knew what would happen. I would lose $250,000, and Stockman would lose over $500,000. That's a punishment. And it did happen. And I'm sorry for those people. I'm not sorry that that happened, because that was my punishment to him for screwing them. I came into it bringing a lot to the table, bringing more to the table than the other side did. I brought all the sculptures, most of the lines, the most popular lines, and about 70% of the billing. And I basically took second place because I let Jim remain president. His ego had to do that, and I became the sales manager because I had to do that. Now, one could look back with some recrimination on missed opportunities and bad judgments. But I'm going to throw the whole pile on top of Mr. Ray Stockman. If he had not behaved in the manner that he did, this probably would be bigger than Reaper is now, and still going. And I'd still be there. And we'd all still be there. And probably pretty well, because I like to treat people well. I have a big ego, I admit it. I'm a show person, I'm an entertainer, but I'm kind of a likable entertainer. I am very popular. I was the headliner for 20 years for all the major shows. And I'm in 142 magazines, there's some of them over there. But I am realizing when I arrived here, I looked at all of the fine work that Dave Helber had done. He has really made a face for this company in his graphics and his control of graphics. I find them very excellent. I think a lot of our success is due to that work. I think your work has really been good. I think Max Carr has been an excellent sculptor. I think Steve did pretty good work. Stan Glanzer, I don't need to talk about. Stan had a tendency to make a somewhat wooden figure, but I did get in there and animate some of them and then got into detail. But I was out on the road too much. You can't do everything. That was the problem I ran into all of my situations. There was Frank Hinchliffe, but he had his own sculpture in Peter Gilder. I was my sculpture and my company and my advertising manager and my everything. So I always ran into the problem of I was not able to do everything. So you can see why Heritage was an interesting opportunity for me. There was somebody who would run the financials, would run the production, theoretically, Cleve was supposed to run production and Jim was going to run the financials. And I'd run the sales. That sounds pretty good, doesn't it? And it should have worked. But Jim was a divide and conquer person and very jealous of me, I guess. Telling tales out of school, I was that popular kid in school that some of you liked and some didn't. I was the best baseball pitcher. I played music. The girls liked me. Everybody knew me. I went back to my 51st high school reunion, the only one I ever went to. And a guy came up, shook my hand, and said, "I've hated you for a lot of years." I said, "Thank you." That's an interesting introduction. He said, "Do you remember, I was one of those fringe kids, you know, I didn't even remember him. I didn't even remember his face or his name." He said, "I looked at you, and you and your friends just looked down on me and never paid any attention to me." And I said, "Well, if it were now, I would bring you into the mainstream. I feel differently about that. I was a callow young person, and I was exulting in my good fortune. And I'm sorry that I did that. I wouldn't do that now. I'm 80 now. I've lived lots of lives. I've had lots of chapters. I've made a lot of mistakes. I've done some good things. One of my chief regrets is leaving my friends in the lurch at Heritage. And I had to confess to Dave tonight that my principal purpose for coming here, in addition to seeing all of you after 35 years, was to issue an apology to you because I knew what would happen. I felt at that time I had no alternative. I was just gradually getting screwed. And Gary offered me a chance to help make that company go. And I went up there and it did go. You all know, I don't have to tell you about that. I was there at its peak. I was at the toy fair. I sold Toys R Us. I called on Cy Ziv. I called on all those people. I've had an inordinately large share of opportunity in this minuscule hobby. I thought that I could make it a big number. I was wrong. This is basically a cottage industry. It's best when it's manufactured direct to customers with a high margin. It doesn't have room for distributors. It barely has room for dealers, let alone distributors. That was my mistake. I ran it through distributors and dealers. I had quite a distributor network, I mean in the hundreds. And I could call them all up on the phone. When Scotty Bowden came out with his initial Napoleonic game, which was overly complicated, but he and Jim Getz, my friend, had done it, I pre-sold 15,000 of those. Nobody had ever sold 15,000. Nobody had ever had a print run like that. And that was a heritage. Remember when we had those? It went very well. So I had good contacts, and I could sell most anything through that channel.